Nice to see you. I'm going to give it a few seconds to let people get settled into the Zoom room, but it's nice to see so many of you here today. I'm Libby Lenkinski, Vice President for Public Engagement at New Israel Fund and full-time moderator of webinars, as some of you know. I'm going to give it just another couple of seconds because I see that people are still getting situated. Hi, Jan. Okay. I think I'm going to jump in. So good afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are. I'm really excited to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this special webinar, NIF, Our Story, Our Values, and Our Plan of Action. This has been something that we've wanted to do for a while. And the reason is, it's all wrapped up. What I want to say is both the reason why we're doing this call and what this call is. But it's situated in a pretty insane context. And not only today, as I think we're all looking at headlines, bracing ourselves for what's happening on the ground in Israel as we see the ceasefire broken and the resumption of war, but also NIF over the last handful of years, but especially over the last 2 years, we've really been from crisis to crisis to crisis to crisis. And that has been grueling, but it's also been a period of pretty extreme growth for the organization. There are a lot of new people who have joined us because of one or more of these crises. We often say that, we don't celebrate the growth, but we really appreciate the growth. We know that it's coming out of crisis and struggle, whether it was 5 rounds of national elections, the events of May 2021, the COVID crisis and how that impacted groups on the ground, or more recently, the judicial coup leading into the worst crisis of many of our lifetimes, which was October 7th and the ensuing war in Gaza. And at each of these points, NIF has seen an influx of new people who have joined us in part because of the commitment to shared humanity and compassion, and also the boots on the ground and our ability to really care for the most vulnerable groups through these crises. And so today's call is both a sort of basic introduction to our history and where New Israel Fund came from and who we've been over the decades before so many new people joined us, and perhaps a refresher and a reminder for some of our longtime supporters. And I see many of you on this call as well. In part because of these crises, we haven't really been talking about our history as much. And so this is a chance to touch base with our global CEO, Daniel Sokatch, and Shira Ben Sasson, Associate Director in Israel, and myself, about how we got to this moment as an organization and what we're doing now, who we are today. And again, I want to acknowledge that this call has been in the making for a long time, and we had no idea when we scheduled it that it would be sort of day 2 in the resumption of violence on the ground. But here we are. And Daniel always says, when the crises come, we were built for these moments, and so here we are yet again. I also want to say, just by way of welcoming, that, and this is really from our hearts, not just a talking point, but the strength of this community around the world of New Israel Fund supporters has been how many of us have gotten through these dark times. I'm saying for staff, for board members, for donors and supporters, and for the grantees. The fact that we've been able to count on our community to continue to support the important work on the ground, to stand up for shared futures, and to try to alleviate suffering wherever it is, has been a North Star for us. And so we want to thank you all. new supporters, longtime supporters. It's that this is how we continue to survive and thrive organizationally during these incredibly difficult times. And so with that, I want to introduce Daniel Sokatch and Shira Ben Sasson Furstenberg. I'm going to go first to Daniel, and let's just get right to it. I have heard you do the NIF 101 spiel many times before, but can you share with us just a little bit of NIF's founding story, or as you often call it, NIF 1.0?
Yeah, well, thanks, Libby, and it's good to see you all. I'll just reiterate what Libby said, that this is such a strange time because things are so dynamic and so many things are happening. And we thought, because of the thousands and thousands of new supporters that we have, we wanted to review where we came from. And we're going to try to do both things today. We're going to review where we came from and briefly where we are right now. And as always, we'll go deeper into the things of greatest interest to our community in the coming months. I just want to say one thing before I jump into NIF 101. On the 16th, it was just a few days ago, Libby, you had an op-ed, you co-authored an op-ed in the New York Times about the film No Other Land, which you were involved with through when Libby's not working for NIF in her spare time, she is running an arts and culture project that is in fact a part of New Israel Fund called ALBI. And in that capacity, she wrote a terrific op-ed about No Other Land. So you should all read it if you haven't had a chance. And with that mention of where we are now, I'll go back to the history of this organization of ours. So what I always like to say is that New Israel Fund was founded by a small group of progressive Jews right here in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1979, who felt that the ways of connecting to Israel, they really cared about Israel, but they felt that the ways of connecting to Israel that were then available to them were not in and of themselves sufficient. They didn't want to just write a check to the local federation or to the American Friends of fill in the blank, the Hebrew University, the zoo, the biblical, the art museum, the hospital. They had sort of two constructive critiques that they wanted to solve through New Israel Fund. The first one was they wanted to be in partnership with actual Israelis. And what's so interesting about this is that if you look at the philanthropic landscape in 2025, or maybe let's say 2024, before the whole world tilted off its axis, what you saw was a fully developed desire on the part of many donors across the philanthropic spectrum to be more hands-on engaged with the work they were doing, to be more in touch with the work on the ground, whatever it is they're supporting. And so it's interesting that almost 50 years ago, NIF's founders were inspired by that same motivator. They wanted to be engaged with the work instead of just writing a check, and they wanted to be in partnership with real live Israelis. And so this small group of founders took a trip to Israel to meet with some of the young Israelis who were then beginning to do all kinds of exciting work. So part one of their critique was, we want to work with real Israelis and be involved in the work. But part two was an interesting theory of change, as we say in the business. They and their friends in Israel had a critique about Israel in 1979, and it was this: Israel did not have a civil society sector in 1979. That is to say, Israel did not have that rich ecosystem of nonprofit organizations that represent marginalized communities and minority voices and unpopular issues, whether that's the environment or civil rights or the rights of Arab citizens or of new immigrants or of women or of LGBTQ people. Israel was almost totally devoid of that entire sector of society, which kind of makes sense when you think about the fact that it was founded by these kind of socialist Eastern European Jews who didn't have any experience with that kind of democratic infrastructure. And so NIF set out in 1979 to bring online an Israeli civil society. And I happen to have right here a wonderful show and tell from that era, because here you can see the preliminary grant list of New Israel Fund from November 1979, from that first trip. And when you look at this incredible document, what you see are the descriptions of Israel's first rape crisis centers. They called them battered women shelters in those days. Its first LGBTQ center, its first people-to-people Jewish, Arab, Israeli organizations that were working on building bridges between communities, organizations dedicated to helping Bedouin women. It's an extraordinary document that really shows that the DNA of our organization existed all the way back then. And the last quick word I'll say is, and this is something I think most of us are familiar with, but there were three strategies that NIF employed to do the work. In '79, it was just grants. And interestingly, we calculated that in 2025 dollars, the first grant tranche into Israeli civil society by New Israel Fund, which again, these are grants that were given to launch the first organizations in almost all the fields that I just named, except for one. The Association of Civil Rights in Israel, our flagship grantee, had founded the year before. And so we worked with those guys to be their first significant funders. Everything else was launched by NIF through these grants. And a couple of years, oh, by the way, it was $250,000 in 2025 dollars, which I think is sort of interesting, right? I would have thought it might have been less. For $250,000, we launched the civil society sector in 1979 and 80. And a few years later, the board of New Israel Fund recognized that merely sending grants to brand new nascent organizations was not sufficient, that they didn't have the capacities and the skills to know how to use the money to work in coalition with other organizations, to do permissible lobbying, to work with boards of directors, to do all the unsexy, unglamorous back office work that you need to do to become an effective nonprofit organization. They needed to learn how to write grants. They needed to learn how to raise money. And so New Israel Fund created in the early 80s Shatil, or Seedling, which of course today is NIF's capacity building arm, our operational arm, and the largest nonprofit capacity builder in Israel or the Middle East. And then finally, the board brought online special projects. And some of you have heard me joke that we've never come up with a better name for them over all these years. My favorite story is one that right before COVID, we declared victory and wrapped up, and that is our Law Fellows program. And many of you remember it. Those of you in DC may really remember it. For almost 40 years, every year, we selected an up-and-coming two young civil rights attorneys from Israel, usually one of them Jewish, one of them Palestinian citizen of Israel. We brought them to Washington, where the American University's law school donated an LLM, a master's degree in civil rights law. In other words, the university provided this free of charge for these specially selected young attorneys. We then placed them with a sister organization in Washington to do an internship. You can guess the kinds: the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Lambda Legal Defense, et cetera. Then they went home and they did a year's service in one of our grantee organizations. And virtually every case of impact litigation that reached the High Court of Justice during the period of time of the Law Fellows program was brought by one of those Law Fellows. Every case that expanded rights or constrained the government's rights was brought by one of these Law Fellows. From the case that successfully desegregated Jerusalem city buses in 2011, a couple of years later, the case brought by a former board member, Ifat Biton, who was a Law Fellow, which ordered the desegregation of ultra-Orthodox girls' schools, where little Mizrahi girls and little Ashkenazi girls were not being permitted to learn in the same classroom, to the case that ordered the army to reroute the security barrier between Israel and the West Bank so that it did not totally adversely impact the lives of Palestinian farmers. All those cases, and by the way, the case that integrated the Israeli Air Force, allowing women to become fighter pilots, all of those cases were brought by NIF attorneys. And Libby, that's sort of what NIF was up until right around the time that I came to the organization, and a couple of years later when you joined it. We were this wonderful, not all that well-known, benign operating foundation that had planted and watered and grown the seeds of Israeli civil society.
Yes, at the time we said we let 1,000 flowers bloom. And indeed, that's what it was like. And I've been at NIF since 2013 or so, which is insane. And when I joined shortly after you, and right at the height of the kind of first wave of attacks from the sort of right-wing NGO ecosystem against New Israel Fund, which many of us who have been around for a long time remember. First, it was with our then president, Naomi Chazan. But it was also a signifier of a kind of new wave of, I mean, what we talked about at the time as attacks on basic democratic infrastructure. We talked about democratic recession. We talked about the dismantling of certain democratic institutions and norms that Israel and Israelis had come to take for granted, and that really the going after NIF and the targeting NIF was a stand-in and a symbol, however unpleasant it was for us. And it really was. I mean, your first board meeting, I remember, was like right at that time. And it was really defining for basically from then and until now. So will you talk about the last decade and what this shift has meant? I mean, this is the kind of moment, sort of like what we talked about in the beginning, in the welcoming to this call, that like, I think we wish that we hadn't been right about those warning signs that we were trying to bring out into the public sphere at the time, and often being told, oh, you're alarmist, don't cry wolf, democracies are stronger than that. And I think we wished that those voices were right and that we actually had been sounding a false alarm. But unfortunately, I think globally, that has not been proven to be the case. I think that the alarms were well placed and back then. Anyway, will you talk about the last decade or so?
Sure. Well, you reminded me, because of the nature of this call, I'll do something of this Zoom. I'll do something I don't ever do on Zooms. I'll tell you a very quick story, everyone, about my very first board meeting. As Libby said, this was in 2010. I joined at the end of 2009, and I was quite literally in the airport in San Francisco, getting ready to fly to New York City for my first board meeting, when my phone rang, and it was a guy called Avrum Borg, who happens to be the uncle of Shira Ben Sasson, but who was then an NIF board member. In his previous life, he had been the youngest speaker of the Knesset in Israeli history, the leader of the Labor Party, a very influential guy, and a friend of NIF's, and a board member. And he called me. I was at SFO, and he said, "Danny, have you seen the newspaper? Have you seen the news about what's happening to us?" And I said, "No, what are you talking about? I'm about to get on a flight." It was a red eye. He said, "Oh, I'll tell you in New York. Have a good flight." And he hung up. And so I had, 5 hours of wondering what the heck he was talking about. But when I landed, I learned that New Israel Fund had come under attack. And a right-wing organization in Israel, supported by the government, called Im Tirtzu, had launched an attack on NIF, accusing us of supporting human rights organizations, which of course was true, and accusing those human rights organizations of being responsible for the Goldstone report, the UN report on Israel's actions in the first of the wars with Gaza, which ultimately led to the current horror show. And those allegations were not true. The human rights organizations had done what they always do, which is hold up a mirror to Israeli society. And the Goldstone folks had gone on their websites and read that information and cited some of it in their reports, just like the State Department in the US did, and the IDF did, and the Europeans. Nonetheless, this was the beginning of an attack on NIF, which, as you said, Libby, turned very personal into attack on Naomi Chazan, a former deputy speaker of the Knesset, who was portrayed with a horn coming out of her head, almost like something out of Der Stürmer, because, of course, the word keren in Hebrew means both fund, as in the New Israel Fund, but also horn. So in any event, it was a really ugly period. And what I remember is at that first board meeting, we took a decision to fight back hard. And I knew we were on the right track when the Jewish Daily Forward, when the Forward newspaper ran an article the next day that said NIF comes out swinging. And for the last 15 years of my tenure, I feel that we have basically been swinging cheerfully, as the cheerful warriors that we are, to promote a different kind of future for Israel and a different kind of democracy. And as you said, we were accused of being hysterical and hyperbolical and chicken little. In fact, one journalist who really ripped into us in 2010, I spotted at one of the big democracy protests when Mickey and I were there a couple of years ago before October 7th. And I said, "Oh, I want to go up and give him a piece of my mind." And Mickey said, "You always tell me that journalists buy ink by the barrel, so maybe don't." And I took his advice and didn't. But here was a guy who was attacking NIF for being hysterical, who was chanting "Demokratia" on the front lines of the democratic protests. And I think that what's important for us to remember here is that we saw this development. We took it seriously. Nomi called it democratic recession. We began to talk to people in places like Hungary and Russia who had experienced similar kinds of situations long before it became clear that's what was happening in Israel. And we made a decision to bring online in 2014, what I sometimes call NIF 2.0. If this is NIF 1.0, what we did with the new initiatives for democracy in 2014 was NIF 2.0. We brought online a new layer of infrastructure for the nonprofit sector in Israel, based on, it was like an Israeli authentic, organic version of what we had seen develop in this country under the second Bush administration. And we went and had conversations with American NGOs like the Center for American Progress, an applied progressive think tank, with MoveOn.org, with the Truman Center for Security, with ProPublica and Media Matters. And it was very heady. And you'll remember from your earliest days, Libby, and Shira will remember, they all volunteered to help us. And they took a trip to Israel with me and some other NIF leaders, some of these folks, to really meet with young Israelis, just as our predecessors had done in 1979, who had great ideas about bringing online new Israeli organizations, and organizations like Molad, an applied progressive think tank, and Mitvim, a think tank looking at Israel in the region, a different approach on security. Zazim, we are moving, the first Israeli version of MoveOn.org, or affiliate of MoveOn.org, which we incubated and launched at NIF. Hamashroqit, the Whistle, which was based on Media Matters and ProPublica, that watches what happens in the media. Newer organizations like Fake Reporter and Standing Together. All of these organizations came online because of the work that we did in shifting our focus towards defense of democracy, and then ultimately promotion of a democracy, of a democratic vision that was fast being eroded in Israel. And of course, when we got to the judicial overhaul, the judicial coup of 2023, of January 23, when Netanyahu was brought back to power with the ultra-right, we were ready. And so many people who were watching these events in Israel and abroad suddenly were shocked by what was happening, but we weren't shocked. And in fact, it was our grantees who sparked the first protests that grew into the mass protests. And what we felt was not this terror that Israeli democracy was collapsing, but rather the opposite. We felt in those heady days, the cavalry has finally arrived. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis were on their streets defending democracy. And parenthetically, I will say that the question that I got the most when I was in Israel 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, from board members, from staff members, from grantees, from family was, why aren't you in the United States out in the streets? You are the ones. New Israel Fund taught us that you cannot sacrifice the public sphere when democracy is under attack. You must make your stand in the public sector. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and part of what I hope to export from this moment back home is the spirit of grit and determination and fight that we have seen, however desperately, in Israel over the last few years. The last thing I'll say is that we brought online during this period of time, right before October 7th, the hub, which is one of the things I'm most proud of, based on lessons we learned from South African colleagues and Brazilian colleagues operating in shrinking democratic space. We set up an apparatus. At the center of the hub is a small NIF-funded clearinghouse, so that all of the anti-democratic things that are happening in Israel are kept track of. All the attacks on organizations are kept track of. But in addition to keeping track of what's happening and being a clearinghouse, the hub has spokes radiating from the hub, and each one is an NIF underwritten resource. And if your LGBTQ center in the Sarona is attacked by vandals, you contact the hub and they connect you to security experts who NIF has paid for, who will help you safeguard your institution. If you are cyber attacked we have the same resources to deal with that. If you are the victim of a frivolous lawsuit by a settler group, we have Israel's finest human and civil rights lawyers standing by, underwritten by NIF, to defend you, so on and so forth. So all of this got us to the place where we were on October 6th, with a mobilized Israeli civil society, the hub protecting that civil society. By no means was victory ensured, but of course we also felt we were in it and we were there with the right tools to push back. And of course, then the world changed once again on October 7th.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, it most certainly did. And this is actually the perfect time to bring in Shira Ben Sasson Furstenberg, our Associate Director in Israel. And, you know, some of you know that my own background, like when Daniel met me in Israel, I was working in human rights organizations, and particularly ones focused on human rights in the occupied territories. And throughout my years here at New Israel Fund, we've found all kinds of ways to merge the support for that work with the support of democratic infrastructure inside Israel, understanding that it's not a democracy if it's a democracy for only Jews. And those kinds of values about shared futures felt very hard to find and rare to see in the public sphere on and after October 7th and the ensuing war in Gaza. I think many of us here in the US and also in Israel Palestine have felt the pull of polarization since that time. And Shira, you have really been not only a like moral voice and a North Star since October 7th and long before, but since October 7th, but also architect of our strategy, which held shared compassion and shared futures in all sorts of very meaningful ways. And so I want to ask you a little bit about that, about what the last 2 years or so have been like and where it's leading us. So please.
Thank you. So good evening from Jerusalem. Very, very, very packed and protested Jerusalem tonight. Thousands and thousands of Israelis are pouring into the city, sitting around on the ground, on the floor, in the street around the Prime Minister's residence, and blocking the street and being brutally moved by police. Our police has been undergoing some severe changes over the past 2 years, but I was concerned I wouldn't be able to make it in time to be here on Zoom with you, and that I would have to take this Zoom call from traffic, because Jerusalem really is under crazy traffic today because of the protest. And that makes me strong and feels, you know, like people are still at it. And it's been an exhausting 2 years, and even before, but we're still at it. It's like another job, you know. Protest has become like another additional job for people, for us here, for younger and older people. You do whatever you can as many times a week as you can, because there are so many options to protest near your house or in another town or on your street. Or we've really perfected our resistance muscles and energies. And that is, I'm saying that not as NIF, but definitely not disconnected from our role in Israeli civil society. I want to say something before I talk about the NIF focus and direction in the last 2 years, and also looking ahead. I've just listened to Daniel tell his NIF 101 story. And I think, I mean, we're heading at the Seder and the Passover Seder in the next month, exactly. I don't know if you're ready, so mark your calendars and start working. But it felt to me, Daniel, almost like being invited to sit in on someone else's Seder and hear them tell the same story that you've told year in and year out with your family around the table, your founding story as a people and as a family. Hear it been told by another family with its own streaks and variations and focus That is the NIF Haggadah, yeah. That is a little, it's the same story from a different person's perspective and focus. And that was fascinating to me as a veteran NIF staff person. And I hope it was interesting for you, friends, as supporters who've been with us for many years and as supporters who've joined us so in such a moving and strengthening way in the past year and 2 years. So how interesting. I will open with this Passover Seder perspective. And I also want to end my comment here, Libby, with a Passover Seder perspective. So I'll be sure to get back to that. So October 7th found us all, of course, shocked and surprised. And it's one of those moments where you ask yourself, where was I? You all have those moments in your biographies where big things happened in the world and you know where you were and how you heard about it for the first time and where it found you. If you were in harm's way, or if you were just waking up in the morning to terrible, terrible news, or going to sleep to scary, terrible news. For us, it was 6:30 in the morning and we were waking up for sirens and terrible news. NIF immediately, and being here on the ground in Israel for over 45 years, immediately understood where we need to be. It was actually rather clear. We weren't at loss for direction or response at even for a second. It's actually, now we're trying to plan, looking ahead, and how to deal with our democratic backsliding and shrinking democratic space, something we've been at for over a decade. But the clarity, the strategic clarity that we had on the first days of the war is actually even shocking to me as someone who's been around for too long. And I think was also rather surprising for our U.S. staff to get such quick responses and clear direction and an outlined campaign to where we need to be, because it was like Libby said, that Daniel said, because we were there and we were building and developing social responses and power and a way to think about impact for such a long time that when it happens, you're ready. And the way we understood our role, the first meeting we had on the night of October 7th already was a meeting with dozens of our shared society Jewish Arab organizations who wanted to get together and think about how to plan and how to bring down the flames inside Israel's mixed cities where Palestinian, Israelis, and Jews live together and have been deeply scarred by events that happened 2-3 years before October 7th, very concerned about how Palestinian Israelis will be treated by Jewish Israelis who are traumatized and scared, and even scared to hear Arabic being spoken here in the streets and in the public sphere. So the first thing we did was to get together and plan together, Jews and Arabs, on how we want to respond. The second thing that we did is we bought hotel rooms, and we never do that. We actually called hotels and said, hello, this is the New Israel Fund. We would like to buy this number of rooms for this number of weeks. And the funny thing was, it wasn't funny because it was war and all, but the funny thing was that Israeli government representatives were calling NIF staff and saying, I heard you can cover for rooms. How many can you take? I have 20 families here in a lot outside a hotel. Could you help me for 2 weeks? And this is the exact same right-wing nationalistic government who has been attacking us heavily all of the years prior to October 7th, and also actually since. But for a short period of time, turning to us to sort of fill in the gap and fill in the vacuum of a government that was totally dysfunctional for at least 2 or 3 months at the beginning of the war, were civil society organizations that were well organized. And after a year of democratic pushback and protest, were already out there ready to respond. And we are the ones who did respond. So getting hotel rooms, making sure that residents of unrecognized Bedouin villages who are in the line of fire in the Israeli South were able to be evacuated from their homes, not even, I mean, homes, but not even houses, into safe spaces where they can even have shelters, and not just for Bedouins, but also. Very, very soon into the beginning of the war, we understood that the Hostage Family Forum is the place to look at, is the group to support, are the people who need us the most. And we did that before it came politicized. And I think later on, sadly, terribly, some people were interested in meddling with and influencing and tearing apart the hostage families, something that I'm embarrassed to even talk about. But to use the hostage question as if it's a right or left question in Israel, as if it's a security issue, as if there is a price too high to pay for the lives of our friends and neighbors, children, grandparents, in my case, real friends and neighbors, a friend and neighbor who was kidnapped and taken hostage and later murdered by Hamas, and to see how the hostage situation became a politicized and a way to sick, how do you say that in English, against each other is just really, really painful. NIF has taken sides. NIF decided who it is we want to support, and those are the families, the brave people who are speaking out. And the two other things we did immediately is because we know that under the fog of war and previously under the fog of COVID, and every time there's a crisis in Israel, security measures are taken, and we know who the first ones to get hurt will be. The first ones will be Palestinian citizens of Israel, not even talking about what's happening simultaneously in the occupied territories. No one can see that. The fog is so heavy. And freedom of speech, freedom of protest. People can write on their Twitter or Instagram or Facebook pages things that I deeply disagree with. But in a democracy, they need to be able to do that. And they don't need to be arrested because they happen to be writing it in Arab letters. And we were there with legal support and public-facing support to make sure that freedom of speech and freedom of protest remain available as much as possible in our struggling democracy. Finally, something that is perceived as very unpopular, and we're working so hard to raise awareness and popularity and just have people's ear at the option of not living by our sword and considering something different for this region looking ahead. And NIF is heavily invested in developing alternative vision, direction, some sort of a roadmap for an agreement, for something of an international effort to bring a different. I need something, to cling on to. And I think us Israelis, I am not responsible to identify the Palestinian partner. I am responsible to send out a hand and to say, I am still interested in peace. And I am willing to invest the time and the effort and the cost that it would take to develop a sensible, comprehensive direction, map, some step toward peace with an Israeli internal voice that would then need international support and a Palestinian partner. And NIF is committed, because we are the New Israel Fund. We are committed to develop the Israeli voices who are offering two different options. Do you want to strengthen the rebuilding of the Gaza envelope, kibbutzim and moshavim and towns where Israelis can live by the values that we keep on talking about? Or are you interested in investing the exact same amount of money or more in settling Jewish settlements inside Gaza? And these are the competing narratives, and we're interested in strengthening one over the other. And I promised I'd open with the Seder and end with the Passover Seder. So I want to say that last year, around this season, Passover time, we were in a very challenging internal conversation, and friends here can attest to that, where we were considering, after doing so much humanitarian support inside Israel for Jews and Palestinians inside Israel, which has never been NIF's, lead action plan. We really are not about humanitarian aid. We really are about deep trends of policy change and building power and pro-democracy and organizing communities, and protecting Israel's challenged democracy in a perspective of equality and justice. But after we did support with whichever way we could the direct needs of people, from diapers to bomb shelters, we said, there are civilians, families, children, innocent people suffering in Gaza. We are not the new Gaza fund. We are still the new Israel fund, but humanitarian aid doesn't stop at the border when everything is on fire. And it was a challenging internal conversation. But I went into last year's Seder knowing that we launched a shared campaign with World Central Kitchen and other veteran refugee organizations internationally who had the access and even the support of the IDF to work inside Gaza and to bring food and medicine to families, to children. It made it easier for me to enter the Passover Seder that way last year. And I thought it was the Jewish thing to do and the humanitarian thing to do and the democratic thing to do. And I was so proud to be part of NIF. I was also really, really scared because I thought we'd get very heavy attacks in Israel. People don't like it when we do controversial things that way. But, we said, what the heck? We gotta know that we're okay with ourselves and with the values that we believe in. And what are we here for if not for that? And I was so honored for us to have made that great decision. It was just a small piece of everything that we're doing. And we do good, feels good at dark times to know that you're doing good.
I have to just interject here that because she won't say it herself, but it was Shira, it was you who called me. Now we're having an unscripted personal moment, friends. It was Shira who called me a year ago and said, "Boss, I can't sleep." That's what you said about what was happening in Gaza. And you said, "Isn't there something we can do?" And to date, we just received yesterday an additional major donation. We're just shy of $2 million. It's, of course, a drop in a bucket, but it's also more than the vast majority of organizations, Israel-oriented, Jewish or other in the world, who have contributed to some kind of alleviation of suffering in Gaza. So I just want to call it out that you were the one who came up with the idea that we had to do something, Shira.
I'm glad you said so, and if you hadn't, I would have. I also really, really appreciate what you said about it's our job to hold out a hand and be a partner for peace, as opposed to wringing our hands and saying, "Where's the partner for peace?" Especially in these times where, and it connects a little bit to what Daniel was talking about with the hub, and to one of the questions that has already come in the Q&A. This is a good chance to say, if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'm about to move us into some questions. But, when Daniel was talking about our efforts with new initiatives for democracy, we had this notion that we could learn from the American system, which had beat back the right and was in this trajectory of progress with President Obama, et cetera. And today we've seen that may have been naive on our part, in that in both places, the ultra-nationalist extremist right is in power. We've seen things that I never imagined were possible in our lifetimes, like the raiding of the educational bookstore in East Jerusalem, owned by Mahmoud Muna, a Palestinian scholar and bookseller whose hand has always reached out to Jewish groups to come and learn. And he is once again under house arrest. The bookstore has been raided. Books have been confiscated. It's the darkest parts of our history are just very visible. And in the United States, there's also massive threats to our democratic norms and to people's basic freedoms. And so, Shira, what have you learned from all these years of exercising the pro-democracy muscle, as you called it, that might be just useful for us to learn from and hear at this moment? And I'm reminding people again to please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. One was related to the question that I just asked.
Okay, what have I learned? I'm still learning. Reality is constantly changing, but something about resistance is that I've learned is that it has the qualities of inertia. Is that how you say that in English? Inertia.
Depends on what you mean
Big
to
Hebrew
say.
word. The big
Inertia.
Hebrew word is inertia. And I guess in English it's similar. And if you start rolling, you'll get the koach, you'll get the energy from, it'll just grow. And when you go to a protest and you feel like you're not alone, or where you speak up and people say, I agree with you, more people than you thought say, I agree with you, or you wear a t-shirt with what you believe in, or you tell people about your involvement with NIF here in Israel. It's sometimes scary to say that. I've learned that it has this inertic quality. I don't know how to, I sound like I speak English. I'm sorry. Sometimes I don't fully. It has this quality of just begetting more energy. And I've been asked so much about hope, and that is just too difficult to answer, too far away to grasp at this moment. It's probably similar for some of you or for all of you with every crazy thing that you wake up to in the morning. But I've learned that when you get started with resistance and persistence and determination, and you remind yourself and your children or anyone that you are in conversation with what your values are, then it makes it bearable. That I will say from the personal perspective. From the NIF strategic perspective, I want to say that I think we've learned something about the balance between ongoing strategic philanthropy on the one hand, and agility and emergency response on the other hand. And when I was a young grants officer, we had an emergency grants pool, and we used to give $500 gifts, $3,000 gifts. It would take us 2 weeks to approve them. We thought we were so agile. And today, we're approving emergency grants by the day, within 24 hours. Sometimes they go as high up as $200,000, $300,000 to anybody who needs them. We were able, because of your support, literally because of your support, to triple our grants budget last year. And our ability to offer, on the one hand, immediate emergency response, and on the other hand, well-planned, strategized, built like an ecosystem, sets of support to groups of organizations that are strategizing together, that build long-term planning, that we can support for years, for a number of years forward, then we feel like we have the ability to respond to the here and now, putting out the fires that we need to, and to the infrastructure of Israeli democracy with the more thought through, planned, and the things that Daniel described earlier.
Thanks, Shira. I'm gonna bring in a question from our dear friend, Mr. Sam Bahur, who I will just say is another Palestinian partner, always with an outstretched arm to welcome Jewish groups for learning, including one of our supporters who's a prize-winning author, Michael Chabon from the Bay Area, who I always do this to you, Sam, and I'm sorry for it, but I'm not going to stop. Michael published a short story about Sam, and the opening line gets me every time, and it says, The tallest man in Ramallah offered to give us a tour of his cage. We would not even have to leave our table at Rukab's Ice Cream on Rukab Street. All he needed to do was reach into his pocket. And if any of us have been on encounter trips and met Sam, he talks often about the millions of permits that he has to use in order to do a simple thing like travel to Tel Aviv for a business meeting. And so Sam is here and asked a question, Daniel, which I think is probably for you, which is, what are we doing? What is NIF doing with regards to Trump's attacks, the Trump administration's attacks on the ICC and the ICJ? And I'm going to piggyback Sam's question with my own, which is also about Israeli legislation, both around the ICC and also just around civil society in general.
So before I answer Sam's and your question, because it's going to be tough. It's tough. We're in tough times. I want to remind us, you mentioned Obama. Obama said famously when he was leaving office in 2016, he said, look, history zigs and it zags. And I want us all to remember, as we discuss the incredibly challenging moment at which we find ourselves, that the lesson, you asked Shira what lessons she derives, right, from all of this. What are the lessons that I take from our work, from my work, is a surprising one, I suppose. As a child of the 90s, or a person who came into political awareness in the 90s, watching apartheid end and the Berlin Wall fall and the Soviet Union collapse and the Good Friday agreements in Northern Ireland and Oslo here, I kind of assumed we were going to see the end of these conflicts. And of course, in our case and in some of the other cases, that's not how things turned out. But the lesson for me is, you may not get to see, we may not get to see, I may not get to see the good ending that we're working for. But the lesson of the civil rights movement in this country, from the end of the Civil War up through, the Civil Rights Act, even the election of Obama, was that generations of people prepared the ground for the moment when the change would come. And without them preparing the ground, without them building the foundations upon which activists and organizations could stand, things might not have turned the way they turned. And I often think to myself, there's nothing wrong with living one's life or devoting one's energies and resources and money to preparing the ground for a vision that you truly believe in. So I think that long view is an important lesson for me. Now, Sam, thanks for your question, and Libby, thanks for yours. There are at least 5 major challenges, and that's just today, right, confronting the sector. And when I say the sector, what I really mean is the New Israel Fund sector and the human rights and civil rights and shared society organizations for whom we serve as a home base and a headquarters. And I'm going to just name 5 of the biggest challenges, which the ones you and Sam named, Libby, are among. One, though, that you didn't name, and it is caught up in the courts right now, is the massive slashing of funding from the United States to groups working for peace and for people-to-people shared society in the Middle East and Israel-Palestine in particular. Nita Lowey, former Congresswoman Nita Lowey, succeeded in putting aside about $250 million that Congress allocated for MEPA, for a funding pool that would support good works in the Middle East. That has been slashed by the Trump administration, as is USAID. And so there are millions of, now, of course, it's stuck in court right now, but much of the damage has already been done. So I want to just name that those attacks are not on NIF directly, but our organizations and the ecosystem we support are vulnerable to them, because if they lose support from the U.S. and from other entities, as we'll talk about in a moment, it means that NIF has to do everything it can to make up those losses, but we're not capable of making up $250 million cut unless one of you is very generous today. So threat number one are the real financial challenges because of the cuts in aid and because of what we'll talk about in a moment. Number two is what we'll talk about in a moment, which is in Israel, there are at least 2 bad bills working their way through the Knesset. Shira alluded to the fact that over the last week or so, we have seen a resumption of the coup on the overhaul of the judiciary and the real attack on what's left of democratic infrastructure in Israel. They're attempting to fire the attorney general. She is one of the last bulwarks against the current authoritarian coalition's desire to have total control We saw that Netanyahu announced 2 days ago he would fire the head of the Shin Bet, the Israeli FBI, who has been critical of him. So as these things are going on, there are two pieces of legislation in the Knesset. One, the so-called NGO bill, which has reared its head before, but in this iteration, this is a bill aimed at shutting down progressive civil society in Israel. It would do so by taxing to the tune of 80% any donation from a foreign government entity to an Israeli NGO that is not supported by the Israeli government. Let me translate that for you out of the legalese of the legislation. What they mean is, if you get money from a foreign government, these are all friends of Israel, by the way, obviously, the United Kingdom, the EU, the Swiss, the Norwegians, these are the people who are funding the Americans, although we don't fund it anymore. If you are getting a donation to your organization from one of those countries or a foundation affiliated with the government of one of these, of Israel's best friends, right? They will tax you to 80%, unless you're also funded by the Israeli government, which is their way of hectoring that only progressive human rights and civil rights organizations will be affected by this, because the government doesn't fund those things. If you get more than 51% of your funding from one of these sources, the bill says, you no longer have access to the Israeli judiciary, meaning that a human rights organization that lives by going to the courts or a civil rights group would be denied or could be denied access. So this bill has not passed yet. It's in the process right now. In the past, iterations of this bill have been defeated by 2 or 3 forces combined. One is the United States and other allies of Israel that have been a guardrail. The U.S. is obviously not going to be a guardrail against this. The Europeans may yet, and the Brits. The second thing that has helped defeat these bills is the independent judiciary, which is under assault in Israel, but still exists. And finally, it's civil society itself. And here I just want to say that in Israel, for all of the flaws and challenges, up until October 6th, and still, it was civil society that managed to poke a stick in the spokes of the wheel of neo-autocracy and authoritarianism and stop, at least temporarily, some of the most egregious and worst attempts by the government to erase democracy in Israel. That's something I hope we learn a lesson from here in the United States at this time. But again, you don't support the ACLU only when things are good. You support them when things are bad in the hopes that things will be good again. Now coming to Sam's question, right? There's also a bill in the Knesset that would criminalize any organization in Israel that works with the International Criminal Court, that is The Hague, which has issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu, former Defense Minister Gallant, and 3 dead top Hamas leaders, all of whom have been issued arrest warrants by the ICC. In response, there's not only the Israeli legislation, but the piece that Sam asked about. That is an executive order by the Trump administration, which is out there right now, which criminalizes any American or American institution that supports anyone who the government, the Trump administration, deems is cooperating with or supporting the ICC. Now, here's where the rubber hits the road. So I just want you to take a moment. This is language that used to be aimed at terrorist organizations during the Patriot Act era, right? If American individuals or NGOs supported institutions that were supporting terrorism, they would be punished criminally. The punishment is now for any American organization or institution that supports anyone who is cooperating with one of the highest courts on the planet, The Hague, founded after World War II because of what the Nazis did and their unwillingness to police themselves. So we support human rights organizations that, of course, would cooperate with The Hague if asked to cooperate with The Hague. That's what human rights organizations do. Now that behavior is criminalized here in the States and likely will soon be criminalized in Israel. For now, what it means, Sam, is that NIF has to say that our funding for human rights organizations can't be used for the purposes of cooperating with the ICC. And Israeli human rights organizations are also under criminal penalties by the U.S., but also, we believe, soon to be in Israel. And so many of them are going to be chilled out of cooperating with or talking to the ICC because it will be criminal if they do. Let's remember, as Sam, of course, knows, it was just a couple of years ago in an even more moderate Israeli government when the Israelis shut down 7 Palestinian human rights organizations on very flimsy logic. We stood in solidarity with those organizations. It is not a stretch to think that now the same thing may be coming for Israeli organizations. The good news is I believe that soon we will see a major attempt by progressive American civil society in its most powerful actors to challenge the legality and constitutionality of this executive order. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, I was muted. Wow, what a
What an
rookie's
amateur mistake
mistake
for you,
after
yeah.
thousands of webinars. I see that the time is about up. And so by way of closing remarks, I think I want to just ask you both to like we've had some really big picture thoughts about the future, but I want to ask you both just what you want to leave us with for the coming days and weeks. You know, I for one no longer make plans beyond the next few days. And so what can you tell us by way of signing off of this call about how you're approaching the next few days and weeks? In a nutshell.
Thank you. So I want to tell you that I am left with really an appetite to talk to this group of people specifically, so much more than what we were able to do in this past hour. And I'm intrigued by, you know, on the one hand, group of people here on this call who've been with us for so many years, sometimes for decades. That to me, you are to me my community, and I don't know all of you, and I'm left with a big appetite to continue the conversation. And in addition, learning as an Israeli that so many people found NIF, Davka, specifically at this time, and decided to make their first gift to the New Israel Fund, specifically at this time, has been so meaningful for me. And you are the other group of people here on this call who I'm so intrigued and left with a huge appetite to be in conversation with. So what will I will take with me for the next few days and for the future of my work at the NIF is a big appetite to continue the conversation with you, to meet you on webinars, and you have to let us know if anything you heard today was interesting and you want us to talk about, or if you want me to come and visit you. Our staff is here on the call. Tell them I will come. I promise. Get your friends, and I will. If you found that interesting, or any of our staff, they're everywhere in the U.S. and they're great. So I'm left with the power of community, and the power of this community, and the power of truth, and remembering what truth is. And truth is here. My friend Vivian Silver, may she rest in peace, in a video said, look at everything that's happening outside and look at everything that's happening inside this room. And everything that's happening inside this room is how it should be. So that's what I'm taking with me. And toda rabba.
What I'm taking with me is, you said I always say NIF was built for moments like these the last 3 years, but NIF was built for moments like these. And, the people who have done everything they can to hijack the state of Israel and send it down the path that it's going down, the extreme settler and ultra-Orthodox and MAGA Likud right, are a small minority of Israelis, but they've managed through grit and commitment and determination to take over the apparatus of the state. The people who managed to send the UK spiraling out of the EU, one of the greatest inventions of the post-war, maybe the greatest, were a small, determined band of people with a vision which I believe was completely terrible and destructive, but they believed in what they were doing and they convinced the country to follow them. And here in our country, the MAGA folks are a small minority, but they're in the process of trying to hijack the ship of our state. So what I take from this is that we can be a strong, determined group of people who can move the Overton window back in the right direction or the left direction. We don't have to accept that this is how things are. It is, as Margaret Mead used to say, it is only small groups of people who've been able to change the world. And that is who we are, and that is what our task is, to be on the vanguard of the pushback against anti-democracy on the critical front of Israel. And I think there's nothing that could be more honorable or more important for us to do together.
Thank you very much. And thank you again to all of the new and longtime supporters who joined today, and also those who didn't join today. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your support. And We will keep you posted about upcoming events and webinars. If something from today sparked your interest, or if you would like to go deeper into one of the issues mentioned, please reach out to us. We can always be available, and we can even set up further webinars to address some of those questions and curiosities. So have a good day, deep breaths, and we'll see you again soon.